Have you ever noticed that as soon as the initiative die is picked up, your players whip out their weapons and magic spells and just burn a swath through all the enemies, not really giving it the time of day?
God loves violence.
Well, then maybe hazards are a thing for you. Give them a little trap that maybe separate one or two of the player characters from the rest of the group. Or maybe have some evil spirits come and conjure and just to do random effects to the party that have no explanation until they look deeper into the mystery. Well, we're going to check out hazards and show you exactly how to use them in Pathfinder Second Edition. So for those of you who are newer to Pathfinder Second Edition, or maybe you've only been running specific adventures that may or may not have hazards in them, and you've been playing Pathfinder for a little while, you may not know what hazards are and how they can be useful to your game. So hazards is a catch-all term that came out for Pathfinder Second Edition for all manner of traps and magical effects, and in some cases, haunts, which is something specific to Pathfinder, that is designed to slow down your players. It could be traps laid by people who are taking over a keep. You know, things like a spike, go traditional. We're going to go to a spiked trap, or a fall-away floor, or a giant boulder that falls from the ceiling and starts to tries to crush some of the player characters. Or it could be, like I said, some evil spirits that come back from the grave. Ooh. So we're going to talk about different types, and we're actually going to talk about how hazards work. Because hazards, when you look at a hazards stat block, it looks very similar to a monster's. So you might think that these act in the same way, but hazards have special rules that go along with them to make them act different depending on the type of hazard. So there's three main types of hazards. Obviously, mechanical. Magical, some sort of magical effect is triggered by you interacting with some part of the environment.
Lucky this plowing thing's here, really. Whoa!
Or haunts, which is usually spiritual in nature.
Come play with us, Daddy.
Those are the three main types of hazards, but also could be hazardous environment as well. It's just the environment in itself is dangerous. We're going to take a couple look at hazards today. And the reason we're talking about hazards is that Jared just came out with a video, our last video, and he talked about the top 5 things that GMs should know about when running their game, especially if you're new from another gaming system. So you can check out that video right here if you want to take a look at that, the top 5 things you should GMs should know when they're running a game. And one of the things that we mentioned in that video was hazards and how do they work. So when you look at it on Archive of Nethys, or if you have one of the books that has a lot of these hazards in it, the core rulebook has a bunch, and they keep coming out with more and more hazards as more and more books come out. Book of the Dead just came out. There was some, actually, we're going to look at one from the Book of the Dead. And hazards come in 2 generic flavors. You have simple and complex. The major difference between these two is simple has one effect when it happens, and that's it. And maybe it resets, maybe it doesn't. But generally think of it as the trigger of a simple is whatever the trigger is. So a person picks up a note, or they walk into the room, or they, cross halfway into the room, or they interact with a book, or they do something to the environment, and the hazard will list what their trigger is. Now, if they didn't detect it, maybe they're not searching for it. Maybe they searched for it and they didn't roll high enough, or maybe the hazard in question is really hidden based on the checks that it tells you in the list, in the stat block of the hazard. And maybe no one detected it. Like I said, maybe your players are just rushing to the end of the dungeon. They want that sweet treasure, and they're not paying attention. And this is a way that you might be able to either slow them down or just make sure that they're aware that the environment is dangerous. It's not just monsters that are trying to get them. It's not just the big bad. The big bad has laid traps, or maybe, like I said, the environment is just generally dangerous. So anytime you take a look at a stat block, and we're going to put one up right over here, it's going to look very similar to a monster stat block. So we're going to look at the simple hazard called Final Words. Like I said, we're going to look at a simple one. These are pretty straightforward. So they all have a stealth, for the most part, they're going to have a stealth DC or a stealth modifier. And they're not actually hiding, but maybe it's like a disguised floor, but it's really a fallaway floor to a spiked pit trap. So if it's hard to see, it may roll stealth against the players, or the players may be rolling perception to see the trap. Now, one thing you're going to notice is that hazards list a proficiency for some of these checks. Now, what that means is if it not all of them list a proficiency, but if it does, that means that the player who is searching is actively searching, or even passively searching, because maybe it's disguised and maybe they're not actively looking, but they're passively kind of checking out the environment. This is the proficiency that is minimally required for them to even have a chance at detecting it. And it has a stealth DC of 22, and it has to be trained. So whatever you're using to detect, most likely it's going to be perception at this point. You need to be at least trained. Now, every character is trained, correct? In perception. I don't think I've ever seen a player character who is not trained in perception, but this may be that you're using another skill. This is not always perception, but it can be. And it kind of defaults to perception in a lot of cases. But maybe you're rolling that Arcana check or you're rolling a religion check in the area because maybe you're already dealing with something like that. And the player's like, oh, well, I'm going to walk over this room, I'm going to make a religion check. So maybe the person making that check, they need to be at least trained to have a chance of detecting this particular haunt. If you look at the skill section, monsters generally don't list proficiencies. This is the reason why they list proficiencies. It's not the proficiency of the trap itself. It's how hard is it to detect. So say it requires expert, the person who's searching for it needs to have at least expert in whatever skill they're using to find it. Now, like I said, final words, it says, okay, so if they manage to detect it, say they make their perception check and they got beyond a 22, they hear the scratching of a quill upon paper, and you can kind of give them a hint, and you alert them that they know that there's a haunt in the area. And yet again, how much information, how little information is it's up to you, but they've detected the haunt. Now, let's assume that they didn't detect the haunt and you're searching for clues for whatever reason that they're in this area to begin with. The trigger for this one is, like I said, this is a simple hazard. So this is just going to have a reaction, and what triggers that reaction, and most likely a save associated with it. In this case, someone picks some creature, any creature picks up this letter, and this is what's haunted, is this actual letter. And what happens is they get a vision of the person scrawling the letter. And as they're getting this vision of scrawling the letter, they're going to make a save. And what's actually happening is, akin to Harry Potter, as they're seeing the person draw on the letter and they're quilling in the actual note, they witness the person seeing this as they're getting carved into their skin, this actual letter. So I'm actually going to take some damage for this. There's a will save because it's mentally happening to them and their body's making it real. They have a will save associated with it, and they take some damage, and they also take persistent damage as these words are being scrawled into their body. Now, this brings up an interesting thing. So it has a reaction, and haunts are generally things that will always occur, meaning that there's almost always a recharge and a reset of these. Now, some, like a pit trap, can be reset. Someone has to reset it. It's, some of them may be automatic. Maybe it has a reset value. In this case, this resets in 1 minute. Now remember, this only happens when someone picks up that letter and goes, oh, what's this letter? Oh my God, I'm seeing visions. So this is what a simple one is. Now there are ways of getting rid of haunts. Haunts are kind of like a special thing where they kind of recur until some effect, usually some sort of spiritual effect, has been satisfied. And here we go. We can see like the disable, and a lot of times with haunts, the disable is religion-based or occult-based because it is some sort of spiritual effect. In this case, it is a DC 24 religion check. You have to be trained. Yet again, it goes back to that, these have skilled proficiencies on them, and not for it. It's for the players. It's for what the players need to be able to interact with it. DC 24 religion check to ward off the haunt, and that will completely stop the haunt. Or you can make a DC 25. You notice it's a little higher for thievery, and you also need to be trained to dispose of the letter with extreme care before the haunt can return. So it's basically you walk into the room, maybe you make some passive checks to see people notice the scrawling noise. Maybe they don't. Someone's looking for clues. They pick up this book. They pick up this book. Oh, what does this letter say? Oh my God, there's visions. And that's it. Sometimes it's persistent damage. Sometimes it's an effect that keeps going until they stop it. So that was a simple one. They walk into the room. If they don't detect it and they meet the trigger, like I said, picking up that letter, that effect happens. It's one single reaction, and then it stops. In the case of the one we talked about, the final word, it has a reset time of 1 minute. So after a minute of the haunt occurring, the haunt can now occur again if someone interacts with the letter again. Maybe the players are trying to figure out what's causing it. Maybe it's a clue that you can put in your game, and that gives them hints. Maybe the person that they have a vision of gives you clues on something else about the dungeon, or it could just be just a random haunt that is just some spirit that has been long dead and it's just been haunting the area. You can put as much or as little lore into this as you want, or you can just, like I said, or you can use it, just put a speed bump on your players to go, oh, hold on, you gotta pay attention to what you're doing, because otherwise these haunts and traps and stuff are going to kill you. Like I said, that was simple. So now we're going to go to complex. So complex, you're going to have a lot more stats, but it's going to have the same initial, it's going to still have a stealth score. It's still going to have, and in some cases, it's going to have a DC to whether they can notice it, or whether they're making a check against the trap or the hazard, or the players are making checks against the trap, saying, I want to be able to see if I can see it. Okay, well, the DC in this case is 26, and they need to be expert. This one is called a spinning blade pillar. So some of these names are just awesome. These are both hazard level 4 hazards. Like I said, the final word was a simple one. This one's a complex. So the stealth here is plus 11. So it has a plus 11. So if it's rolling stealth against the players only need to be trained in their perception, or a DC 26 expert perception check to notice the control panel. So there's a control panel somewhere in the room. It's a little harder to see because they need to be expert to be able to see it. And then there's a stealth check of plus 11, which you will roll for the trap against the players. This will be obviously a secret check. They're not going to know you're going to roll. Well, hopefully they don't know you're rolling. That's if you're up to secret checks. We have a whole discussion about that. Contention between Jared and I about secret checks. But basically, see, the trigger for this one is someone steps on a hidden panel in the floor, which activates the trap. The effect is the trap, as in its reaction, if someone does not say nobody noticed it, and they walk into the room and they step on one of these squares, the immediate reaction is raising pillar. So the pillar pops out of the ground and then does this cool effect. The trap pops up in a grid intersection, so specifically in a grid intersection where all the corners of squares meet, and it makes spinning blade attack against one adjacent creature as the blades, I guess, pop out. So the pillar pops out of the ground, its blades extend, and it hurts one person near it, and then it goes into its initiative. So it will roll initiative, and then it said, once it takes the reaction, it rolls initiative, and everyone rolls initiative. And now we're in initiative, and now the battle against the trap commences. So because these things, especially mechanical ones, can be attacked, so mechanical hazards can be attacked and destroyed, they have saves. Hazards generally have immunities, and based on the listing, it's similar to a monster's listing in this case. So immunities, it says immune to critical hits, and it has object immunities because it is an object, it's not a living thing. And it's also immune to precision damage because it's a spinning pillar of death. Like, it doesn't have any, vital areas. Generally, traps, especially mechanical traps, are going to have a hardness. So that number is subtracted to the damage that is done to it, because these things have, they're tough, they're made of metal and wood and maybe magical mystical materials, so they're going to have some sort of hardness. They're going to have hit points, they're going to have saves because maybe you're shooting a spell at it, maybe you're attacking it with your bow, or maybe that has to roll a save of something. Unlike the simple hazards, complex hazards have an initiative and they act on their initiative. And depending on the hazard, you're going to figure out how to pilot the hazard based on what's called a routine. And if you scroll down, it's going to be at the bottom of the kind of the stat block here. And it's going to have a routine, and then in parentheses, it's going to have a number of actions. This is the number of actions that the trap will take every turn. So sometimes the routine is just one, which means every turn on its initiative, it takes one action, and that's it. And it'll tell you what the action is. In the case of the spinning blade trap, it takes 3 actions. Every time its initiative comes up, it's going to take its 3 actions, and it explains all 3 actions that it takes during its turn. So the spinning blade trap uses its first action to make a spinning blade strike against each adjacent creature. So it just spins in place, and it just ginsus everyone near it. Its second action is to move in a straight line in a random direction. It tells you roll a d4 to determine direction. Oh yeah, and it has a speed. It moves 10 feet. And its third action, it makes a splitting blade strike again against all newly adjacent enemies or creatures. So it has allies, and it doesn't know any better. It's just the non-thinking machine that just spins, moves, spins. This trap is specifically not affected by multiple attack penalty because it's just a bunch of spinning blades of doom that's just going to cut and ginsu up all the people who are near it. And it gives you its attack, which is plus 12, and it gives you its damage, which is 2d10 plus 5. It also says it does have a reset value, so this one automatically resets on its own. The trap deactivates and resets. So this one has an automatic reset where it'll trigger whatever triggered it. It'll pop up, spin blade for 10 rounds unless it's been disabled or destroyed, and then it'll stop, and then it will wait for the trigger again. So this thing can keep activating once a minute and doing stuff for 1 minute. So it can activate and go for a minute, and then it stops, and then it waits for the trigger again, and then it can keep going if that trigger keeps being satisfied and the players don't do anything about it. Other traps happen and then they stop because maybe it needs a manual reset. Someone needs to physically reset the trap, put the spikes back in the pit, close the doors, kind of hide the area. Those need manual resets. Some traps need to be reloaded. Like a crossbow trap maybe doesn't reload, and it has to be reloaded by somebody. So given the stat blocks, like I said, they look similar to creatures, but sometimes they are different. And to disable, like I said, they can damage it beyond repair, and all traps that can be broken in this way will have a break value similar to a shield where it will be broken and it won't reset anymore. So here, like to disable it, to using thievery to disable a device, you have to succeed at a DC 21 thievery check 2 times on the pillar. So actually manipulating the actual pillar itself is a little harder, but if you actually find the control panel and know that there's a control panel, you can go up to the control panel and make the DC 19 expert thievery check. So you have to be at least expert to mess with the control panel, but to kind of fiddle around with the pillar itself, you can kind of break it up and bust it up and kind of pull out maybe gears or pulleys or whatever, and you'll be able to disable it that way, but it requires 2 checks at a higher DC. Or you can interact with the control panel at a single DC 19 thievery check. Like I said, you have to be expert for that, though. But this is definitely a way. Either you want recurring haunts, maybe you want just simple traps or hazards, or you want complex things to constantly pester them. Then you can even put this in a room. Now players could be like, look, we're not dealing in any with this. We're just going to leave the room. You could, if you really want the players to kind of interact with these traps, you could always put it in a room they need to be in. So if they have to be in this room for some ritual or some maybe final battle, and the bad guy kind of knew that the players are coming, they can kind of set up some traps along the way. Just keep in mind that the hazards can be quite deadly, especially ones that persist and they have their own initiative, and every turn they're going to do something. It can ramp up the difficulty quite a bit. So just be mindful of that. But or maybe they have to search a room, and this trap's going to keep going off until they deal with it. So it may slow your group down, or maybe just give you just a different thing. Instead of just like throwing waves upon waves upon waves of monsters at them, eventually that's going to be like, okay, we get it. There's another 1,000 goblins and another Baylor. Okay, maybe it's just something that's more like it's a break from the norm. So give them something that almost like Indiana Jones-esque, and they have to like find the trap, and then maybe it could be a whole dungeon of traps, and the monsters are the unusual thing where there's only a few monsters, but there's a lot of traps because it's an ancient tomb to some dead god, and I don't know, you'll figure it out. But let us know in the comments section if you've ever used traps against your players and how well or badly did it go for them or for you? This is Steve from Nothing Ventured, Nothing Game. May all your die rolls be crits, and may you always roll max damage. See you later.